What up, guys? Stir Fry here, coming at you with the first episode of Dissect the Saga, a show here on Quiply where each week I review a film and a franchise so that franchise is done. For this first chapter, we'll be looking at the X-Men films, from the first X-Men movie released in 2000 to Deadpool, released in February of this year. So without further stalling, let's kick off the very first episode of Dissect the Saga. A lot of people forget that there was a time when comic book movies were some of the most laughable things on the screen. Nowadays, people can't get enough of them, and for good reason. They're all extremely well done. But from the 1930s to the 1980s, and 90s to a lesser extent, people saw comic books less because they looked good and more because they were there. The comic industry was booming, and people camped out at the theaters the night before to see these films no matter how bad they looked. And shit did they look bad. But as more and more of these films began to be made, more and more directors started to think about all the things that could come out of them if they put more effort into these projects. A lot of people like to give Tim Burton's Batman or Steve Barron's adaptation of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles credit for this movement, but I'm not so sure. Granted, I think those were both really good films. I think the film that should be rightfully given the title as Torch Passer should be the first comic book movie released at the turn of the 21st century. The first X-Men. Don't get me wrong, this movie is by no means a masterpiece. In fact, after rewatching it, I actually found it surprisingly underwhelming. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't think this film paved the way for other comic book films. Granted, there are a lot of things about this movie that I'd change if I could. I'm not one of those hyper-comic nerds who gets mad at all the changes in a comic-based film, but I was pretty confused when I saw that director Bryan Singer decide to give the X-Men, some of the most iconic superheroes of all time, mind you, matching biker jackets instead of their actual costumes. Or the fact that they decided to make Wolverine and Rogue castaways that were brought into the school for the gifted instead of them being original members like they were in the comics. But I'll be honest, around the time I saw this movie for the first time, I wasn't really reading the X-Men comics. However, I was watching the X-Men cartoon that aired in the 90s, so that's virtually what I based it all off of. The actual story was pretty good though. A lot of it centers on Rogue, who after discovering she's a mutant, decides to run away from home. She hitches a ride with Wolverine before they're both ambushed by Sabretooth, only to have Cyclops and Storm pop up in a very continuity error-ish fashion. Seriously, one frame they're not there, the next frame they are. While that's going on, there's a Mutant Registration Act trying to be passed by the government to properly regulate mutants, with Jean Grey being one of the advocates against it, and her foil, Senator Robert Kelly, played by Bruce Davison, being for it. Magneto, along with Sabretooth, Mystique, and Toad, have a plan to stop the Registration Act by using a machine that will amplify a gamma ray that will turn any human that it touches into a mutant. But the X-Men show up, kill Toad and Sabretooth, wound Mystique, and knock Magneto out long enough to put him in a plastic jail cell. That's pretty much the whole movie, aside from a couple of one-liners and CGI that was really only good by early 2000 standards. Does that make it bad? No, but as I said, it's really underwhelming. I mean, I loved the X-Men show growing up because of how fast-paced and action-packed it was, and while I do have to give the film credit for being one of the first comic-based films to actually take itself seriously, I feel like it didn't want to push the barriers of what it could do. It's almost like Bryan Singer wanted to do so much more with these characters, but someone grabbed him by the back of the neck and said, "Nah man, that's too much." For a movie that was the first of an explosive, action-packed franchise resulting in 2 separate trilogies, 3 solo films, and an almost $5 billion box office collection, the actual action portion of this movie was subpar at best. Most of the time, the characters are using their powers to do dumb things like moving objects very cautiously or a cheap gag joke. Now, this could be due to the fact that the X-Men were really huge at the time because of the cartoon, and people wanted to get a good glimpse of their powers in a slower, more relaxed environment, because they had never seen it done in live action before. Okay, that's reasonable, but I feel like they took that element too far, and thus didn't actually give viewers a taste of their powers, but rather a limit on them. Now, to be fair, it was a lot better compared to what we had before it, but if we compared it to what we have now, it would feel a little restricted and, dare I say, boring. But maybe I'm not supposed to compare this film to others and just enjoy it for what it is. The setups were pretty nice, and a lot of the acting was really enjoyable. Hugh Jackman was a perfect Wolverine, Rebecca Romijn was a perfect Mystique. I do wish we saw more of Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, but when they were on the screen, they were some of the most genuine people there. So, overall, I would say that even though this movie isn't the best of its own respected trilogy, or even franchise, it's still a huge trademark that should always be thought of in the comic book universe. And now it's time for a segment called Under Over. A segment that I'm going to do at the end of every film review where I give out meaningless virtual awards for the acting and quotes that were both over the top and underappreciated. Award for the most over-the-top acting goes to Anna Paquin's portrayal of Rogue, who could fill up a stadium with her forced teenage screams. Award for most underappreciated acting goes to Bruce Davidson's portrayal of Senator Kelly, who's fluent in condescending asshole, and I love it.
What is it the mutant community has to hide, I wonder, that makes them so afraid to identify themselves?
Award for most over-the-top movie quote goes to the radical concept of lightning that Storm delivered to Toad.
Know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
Award for the most underappreciated line was Wolverine's subtle fourth wall break and how stupid it is these characters get their names.
The man who attacked you is an associate of his called Sabretooth.
Sabretooth? Storm. What do they call you? Wheels?
And that was the X-Men. Hope you guys liked this video. If you did, do me a favor and give it a thumbs up, a sub, and share. Next week I'll be reviewing X2 X-Men United, so keep an eye out for it. Have a good one, everybody.